flavor. We're covering today's top boxing news.
Well, I'm sure most of you have heard already that it appears Anthony Joshua has found himself a dance partner. He's found himself a dance partner in Andy Ruiz. This is going to evoke certain questions. Andy Ruiz having recently signed to the PBC, not but 3 or 4 months ago. I'm sure that many of you are looking at this and thinking to yourselves, is this a turning of the tide? Is the PBC turning over a new leaf? It being that they are notorious for not working well with others. That if they have it their way, they'll basically be an island in the sport of boxing. Does Andy Ruiz crossing over to the DAZN side of the street for this fight, does this herald change? The kind of change that some of us have been asking for. And I dare say no. I'm sorry, I don't want to be the bearer of bad news, but if I'm going to tell the truth, then that's what I have to be. Andy Ruiz crossing a street for this fight heralds no more change than when Felix Diaz and John Molina crossed that street to fight Terrence Crawford. Those are two fighters who you're accustomed to seeing fighting on PBC cards, yet those are two fighters who just so happened to cross the street to fight Terrence Crawford. But I'll tell you that
Use your common sense.
you'd have to suck all the context out of the situation in order to use those guys as examples for what people are talking about. Because when people are talking about the PBC stifling fights, they're not talking about the PBC stifling fights with the likes of a John Molina, with the likes of a Felix Diaz, with the likes of an Andy Ruiz. Those are not the kind of guys that people are talking about. They're talking about PBC's star players, the big names that are part of the big conversations that the fans are often clamoring for. That when people say that the PBC blocks a lot of fights, they're not talking about
Diaz is in Molina.
their second string guys. And I don't say that to slight any of those fighters, respect to all of them. But when people have those conversations, those are not the kinds of fighters that they're talking about. And in this situation, Andy Ruiz, who's a solid fighter, deceptively fast hands, he's a guy who's got his virtues. In this situation,
Pay attention.
Andy Ruiz is not pivotal to the PBC's bottom line in the heavyweight division,
That's where they'd block
to
it.
where they would not allow him to cross that street. Now, a guy like Luis Ortiz, that's a different story. You may be thinking to yourself right now, if you feel that Jay Jimenez's cover story in regards to the debacle between Anthony Joshua and Luis Ortiz and those negotiations and what the fuck happened, if you feel that that cover story is all bullshit and it's really Al Heyman who stopped that from happening, if you feel that way, that he stopped Luis Ortiz from crossing that street, then why didn't he stop Andy Ruiz from crossing that street? And I'll tell you why. Andy Ruiz ain't the one that was promised a Deontay Wilder rematch, is he?
No.
That's Luis Ortiz.
According to his team.
You may remember from a few weeks ago, Stephan Espinoza saying something along the lines of, let's get back to making the big fights for Deontay Wilder. You may remember that. I talked about it here on the channel. And how, as I was reading the article, I got the distinct impression that when he said that, he wasn't talking about Anthony Joshua. But let's get back to making the big fights for Deontay Wilder. I mean, how could you be talking about Anthony Joshua when you guys just turned down an offer to fight Anthony Joshua? If you're saying this now, well, you can't be talking about that guy. We all know that if Deontay Wilder would have crossed that street to DAZN, if he would have took that offer and crossed that street, that would have cut Stephan Espinoza and Showtime out of the deal. So seeing him say, let's get back to making the big fights for Deontay Wilder, that gave me the impression that whatever big fights you're talking about, they're not fights with Anthony Joshua. So we fast forward to today, and Eddie Hearn is alleging that they have already mapped out the next 2 fights for Deontay Wilder.
I hope for Luis Ortiz's sake and his kids and their kids' sake that it's as much money that they're going to get for this supposed Deontay Wilder fight. And are you really telling me that you've already been offered and guaranteed the Deontay Wilder fight, yet this man and their team are talking about, oh, Joshua doesn't want the undisputed fight, and you've set up 2 fights for Deontay Wilder already after the Dominic Breazeale fight? That's how serious they are about the Anthony Joshua fight.
Is Luis Ortiz the boogeyman or...
Is he the boogeyman? Joshua would destroy Luis Ortiz.
Al Heyman won't let that happen. He needs Luis Ortiz on standby. He needs him on standby to keep Wilder busy while they continue to try to raise his profile. So you can see why Al Heyman might put the kibosh on a Luis Ortiz versus Anthony Joshua fight, but not put the kibosh on an Andy Ruiz Anthony Joshua fight. Because he doesn't need Andy the way he needs Luis. Andy Ruiz is tantamount to a new hire. He is not a part of the PBC's senior staff in all the ways that Luis Ortiz is part of their senior staff, and how he's a part of a bigger picture. He has a role to play in their
Bottom line.
long-term plans for their star player in the heavyweight division, Deontay Wilder. Thus, they'll stop a Luis Ortiz fight from happening. But Andy, go ahead, Andy, do your thing. Cause Al needs Luis Ortiz to stay a quote-unquote boogeyman. He needs him to stay a boogeyman so that Deontay Wilder, having beaten him, can mean something. And if by some chance that quote-unquote boogeyman should find himself getting starched in front of 17,000 people at Madison Square Garden by Anthony Joshua himself, the guy who was supposedly ducking this boogeyman, if by some chance that should happen, that whole air of Luis Ortiz being a boogeyman and it being some kind of a big fucking deal that Wilder beat him, that whole air will evaporate, because Luis Ortiz seems to be the crowning achievement of Deontay Wilder's 40-plus professional fights. That in 40-something fights, that's really the most solid guy that he fought. If Joshua goes in there and wipes his ass with him by some chance, well, that's gonna make Wilder seem like mediocre small potatoes. Even smaller potatoes than he already is. So the idea that Andy Ruiz stepping in for Jarrell Miller and squaring off against Anthony Joshua on June 1st dispels the reputation that the PBC has garnered themselves in regards to making big fights happen. The notion that Andy stepping in changes everything, that's bullshit, okay? That doesn't change anything any more than John Molina or Felix Diaz fighting Terrence Crawford changed anything. Context is key, and we all know what kinds of fighters we're talking about. You might let John and Felix cross the street for Terrence Crawford, but you ain't let Danny Garcia cross the street for Terrence Crawford.
Or Spence.
Context is key. In this situation, you might let Andy Ruiz cross the street for Anthony Joshua, but you ain't let Luis Ortiz do that, and you costed him a lot of money and the chance of a lifetime in the process. Also, he could stay an option for your real prize stallion in the heavyweight division, Deontay Wilder. I'll tell you the narratives, the level of reaching
These guys do.
that PBC's fans and Deontay Wilder's fans have to do on a daily basis.
Jesus.
It's fucking tantamount to yoga and Pilates. How much these guys have got to bend and stretch and reach. My God. Tell you what, you get a strong core doing that bullshit. It just sucks that you've got to do that to talk up what is such a mediocre heavyweight champion. Now I'll say this much about the fight between Andy Ruiz and Anthony Joshua, that I would have preferred to see a fight of this magnitude under different circumstances. Different circumstances for Andy Ruiz. That he wouldn't have been a substitute or a stand-in, a spur-of-the-moment kind of opponent. Rather, he would have had more time to prepare, to fully get into zone for just what he's about to do. I would have preferred to see a fight like this under different circumstances. Is it a bad fight? No. Is Andy Ruiz a bad opponent? Far from it. Andy Ruiz may seem innocuous to the casual observer and the casual boxing fan, the one that only knows the name of either Deontay Wilder or Anthony Joshua. You know, he may seem innocuous to the casual fan, but anybody who's seen Andy Ruiz in action knows that this is a guy that's got virtues of his own. Defensive prowess, very fast hands, deceptively fast hands, and very quick counters. He also happens to pack some respectable power, so understand that while Andy Ruiz may seem innocuous at first glance, he's a solid fighter, he's a solid opponent, and a solid stand-in for Jarrell Miller.
Good choice.
Andy Ruiz has won 3 professional fights since having lost that decision to Joseph Parker, a decision that some people think would have went to Andy Ruiz if the fight hadn't taken place in Joseph Parker's backyard. But you know what they say about foreign soil? You don't coast in foreign soil. You can't just do enough. You can't just win. You can't just satisfy yourself. You've got to satisfy the judges and put a stamp on it. If anything, you've got to take it out of their hands. So having a close fight with Joseph Parker in his backyard, well, you know, it is what it is. But there were people who felt post-fight that Andy Ruiz had done enough that he should have walked away with the WBO title. Andy Ruiz is a polished boxer. Even if he doesn't pack quite the concussive punching power of a Deontay Wilder, does not have the musculature and physique of an Anthony Joshua, or the fleet of foot, nimble movements of a Tyson Fury. Andy Ruiz still has his virtues. So what I'll say is that Andy Ruiz is about as good an opponent choice as Anthony Joshua could have made given these circumstances. I mean, he did try to get the quote-unquote boogeyman in the ring, but somebody in the boogeyman's team fucked it up for him. Whether it's the way that Jay Jimenez says it is, or whether it was really Al Heyman and he fucked it up to keep Ortiz out of that fight, one way or another, somebody on Ortiz's side of the street fucked it up. Joshua tried to get him in the ring, so what the fuck can you do? Next best thing, Andy Ruiz. You know, it is what it is. In other news, a follow-up to my previous video story in regards to who should we expect to see contesting for what is now the vacant WBC title that used to belong to Mikey Garcia now that Mikey's gone on to do other things. Abdullaev's promoter had this to say. He says, "We plan on fighting Luke Campbell for the WBC title." That is Zaur Abdullaev, who is ranked in between the WBC's highest-ranked contender, Luke Campbell, and Devin Haney. And the conundrum, at least for Zaur Abdullaev, was that there was a feeling that he may not be ready by September to contest for the WBC world title against Luke Campbell because Abdullaev is a practicing Muslim who would be observing Ramadan. But that's not the case. Abdullaev and his promoter said they very much mean to fight Luke Campbell for that title, that Abdullaev is ready for the big fights, and that's one of them. Now I'm going to tell you something. In spite of Zaur Abdullaev and his promoter saying that they will be available, they will be able to fight for that WBC title, in spite of that, it's still possible that the WBC might afford that opportunity, not to Zaur Abdullaev and not to Devin Haney, but to Vasyl Lomachenko. It's still possible that they rather have their world title involved with a name like Vasyl Lomachenko than a name like Zaur Abdullaev, than a name like Devin Haney. That if Luke Campbell is going to get a title shot, it's conceivable that they might afford that opportunity to the champion of another organization rather than the guys that are already within their ranks. And the reason that this is still possible is because we know how the WBC works and we know what their priority is. Their priority is collecting the biggest sanctioning fees from the biggest fights. Those things in mind, a fight with Luke Campbell and Vasyl Lomachenko in the UK makes far more money than Luke Campbell versus Devin Haney or Luke Campbell versus Zaur Abdullaev, who is even less known than Devin Haney. Essentially what I'm getting at is, don't think that because Zaur Abdullaev is saying that he's available, that nixes the chance that Loma might end up fighting for that title, because as far as I see, the WBC, like many of these other sanctioning bodies, they do what the fuck they want because they write their own rules. Nobody is policing their activity and making sure that they are operating between the letter of the law. These guys write their own laws and their own bylaws.
Shit.
If they feel like they rather give Vasyl Lomachenko that opportunity and Luke Campbell that opportunity, that's what the fuck they're gonna do. Because, really, who's gonna stop them? I'll give you a scenario. One scenario that we might see is, they might actually say, we'll sanction Vasyl Lomachenko versus Luke Campbell for the vacant WBC title, and the winner must then fight Zaur Abdullaev thereafter as a mandatory challenger. They might do something like that. They're very creative when they want to be. Don't let those numbers in the WBC's ranks fool you into thinking that they mean anything, because Dillian Whyte was ranked at number 1, yet somehow both Tyson Fury and Dominic Breazeale were ordered to fight Deontay Wilder before the number 1 contender. Do remember that the rematch with Tyson Fury, the WBC tried to order that fucking thing, in spite of the fact that Dillian Whyte is ranked at number 1, and in spite of the fact that, well, you guys already named a mandatory challenger for Deontay Wilder. So how do you go from naming Dominic Breazeale, the mandatory challenger for Deontay Wilder, but turn right the fuck around and try to order
A Fury rematch.
a rematch between him and Tyson Fury? The WBC has quite a few unethical practices that raise a lot of eyebrows, and those things in mind, it's conceivable that they might say, look, we get bigger sanctioning fees if Loma's name is attached to this vacant title fight, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to afford that opportunity to him so that we can get bigger sanctioning fees as a result. And if Zaur Abdullaev still wants a title shot, he can fight the winner of that fight, but we want these sanctioning fees. That's the priority. That's how we're going to do it. The door is still open for that shit to happen, ladies and gentlemen.
It could happen.
No matter how goofy, nonsensical, or unethical it may seem to me and you, the WBC will still carry on and do as they please because they police themselves. They write their own laws. There's no commission that's overseeing their activities to make sure that they're conducting themselves in an ethical fashion, that they are conducting ethical practices. This is a big part of the reason that when I hear people say that the WBC is the most prestigious of the 4 world titles, I'm often left scratching my head trying to characterize just what exactly is the prestigious part, because they're not the oldest of the 4 world titles. The oldest is the WBA, and in the realm of ethical business practices, they ain't doing shit to write home about, you understand. They do a lot of unethical shit, if anything.
That's true.
Yet they're often referred to as the most prestigious of the 4 world titles. I don't know, maybe they're talking about the color scheme of the belt, the way the gold glows over the green leather, because in terms of ethics, they kind of come up short in that department. And the conundrum here, the ethical dilemma here, is that if they were to order Luke Campbell versus Vasyl Lomachenko, what happens if Luke Campbell were to, be non-compliant? What happens if Luke Campbell were to say, well, I don't want to have to fight Vasyl Lomachenko for that belt? Would they then void his title shot? Because you're ordering this thing like it's a man, you're ordering this thing like Vasyl Lomachenko is the owner of that belt.
And he's not.
As if it is a title shot that he is affording Luke Campbell, when in reality,
It's not his belt.
Vasyl Lomachenko, that's not his belt. That belt is vacant.
Y'all don't rank him.
And Luke Campbell, he got in position for this title shot already many months ago. He aligned himself for this title shot. But if you present it as an order, it's almost like, like you're trying to say that is this Luke Campbell's opportunity to get the belt? Or is this Vasyl Lomachenko's opportunity to get the belt? I'll say what I said in my previous video. I'm not opposed to it being an option, that if Luke wants that fight and Loma wants that fight, then I don't mind if they decide to sanction it. That it should be an option. But what it should not be is an order. It should not be obligatory. It should not be mandatory. Thus, a mandate is unethical. We'll see what they decide to do, but I reiterate, given their history of goofball tactics, it is conceivable that they'll let Loma and Luke fight for the belt and then just name Zaur Abdullaev as the winner of the fight's mandatory challenger.